In 1924, Albert Ostman, lumberjack and forest worker, went to the Tobler Inlet area in British Columbia, intending to spend a few days outdoors, enjoying the wildlife. However, he would end up being the protagonist of one of the most astonishing stories ever heard. And on his first night camping, he woke up in the middle of the night with a strong jolt. The sleeping bag he was resting in was being dragged by a huge animal. We're not talking about just any animal. Ostman would become the first person to be abducted by a Bigfoot. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. A cryptid is an animal or being whose existence is not confirmed by science, but that could still exist anyway. Within this field, the idea that a wild man or some kind of missing link inhabits those landscapes that are not easily accessible to civilization is particularly famous. This creature goes by different names depending on where you are on the map, and its figure shapes one of the oldest living legends in North America. In addition, it inspired fiction, made its way into pop culture, and was the protagonist of heated debates. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Nowadays, there are numerous groups made up of professionals who are dedicated exclusively to searching for evidence of its existence. That's how we have a huge catalog of experiences as dazzling or even more dazzling than those of Ostman. Is it true that a group of gorilla men attacked some miners on the slopes of Mount Santa Elena? Did the United States Army take down one of these beings in 2002? How did the Federal Bureau of Investigation end up getting involved with this creature? What do the most skeptical people say about all this? Today we invite you to join us as we venture deep into the lush forests and the most inhospitable mountainous areas. We want you to be part of this expedition in which we will investigate the curious and chilling story of Bigfoot. For now, I'll tell you that we got some pretty interesting testimonies and some evidence that turned up out there which will make you rethink a lot of things. There are those who claim that the evidence of Bigfoot's existence can be traced back to ancient stories. As proof of this, many point to a very particular word that you've probably heard before, Sasquatch. This term, which over time would become synonymous with Bigfoot, derives from a word that was used by some of the First Nations peoples, the Salish, from the southwest of British Columbia. It could be translated as wild man or hairy man. The question is clear: who or whom were these peoples referring to when they said Sasquatch? Were they referring to members of other tribes, as a group of scholars suggests? Or are we perhaps facing proof that, even thousands of years ago, men found themselves faced with the need to try to describe an unknown creature? No less interesting is the information that comes from the Viking journals. It is believed that an intrepid crew led by the legendary Leif Erikson landed in North America around the year 1000 after Christ. It is believed that during that journey, they encountered a huge figure that sent chills down their spines. Which says a lot, considering the reputation of the Nordic warriors. Are there plenty of testimonies of this magnitude, and can they be found without having to delve into complicated labyrinths? All it takes is a little patience to find various accounts of gigantic beings hiding in the vegetation or in caves. Giants that once inhabited the earth? Maybe. Are they real beings or legends orchestrated to discourage explorers and invaders? It's impossible to know. This news undoubtedly sparked the imagination of scientists and enthusiasts. For years and years, the lingering possibility that the Sasquatch were real became synonymous with controversy. But it would not be until 1811 that the myth would take on increasingly disproportionate dimensions. In that year, the Anglo-Canadian fur trader, surveyor, and cartographer David Thompson made an unprecedented discovery. It should be noted that by that time, David was already considered by some of his colleagues to be the greatest practical land geographer the world had ever produced. His reputation preceded him, so when he set out to cross the Rockies, everyone knew he would bring some surprises with him. Expectations were high, and David did not disappoint them. With solemnity, he announced that on January 7, 1811, he had found, and I quote, "the tracks of a huge animal." Despite his knowledge and experience, the man had not been able to identify the origin of those marks. He would also record that the guides who had accompanied him to that place had shown fear in the face of the discovery. They were curious individuals, used to wandering around these latitudes. However, upon seeing the tracks, they insisted on moving on, urging not to waste time and looking around with obvious paranoia. What was hiding among the mountains? Why were the natives so frightened? David couldn't bring answers, but he did bring the seed of a question that would keep growing and growing. Over time, the researcher began to suspect that the tracks might have been deformed by the thaw, and he settled the matter by saying that they were surely made by a very large old bear. However, today, those tracks are considered the first modern evidence of a Bigfoot, but of course, it wouldn't be the only one. Bigfoot becomes popular. 7 years later, more precisely on September 22nd, 1818, the Exeter Watchman newspaper reported a most unusual story. Near Ellisburg, a gentleman of high standing had seen a kind of hairy man come out of the woods who, upon realizing he was being watched, ran away. The brief encounter was soon reported by media outlets and spread through word of mouth. In fact, a group of self-organized hunters gathered at the exact spot where the sighting had occurred, and for days they tried in vain to find the enormous creature. The search was unsuccessful, but the idea that there was a gigantic being lurking in the wild began to gain unusual strength. Many people put 2 and 2 together. The footprints found in 1811 and the animal man seen in 1818 could be from the same species. Suddenly, an old story that was believed to be a fiction from imaginary towns began to take shape in the present. Fear and uncertainty began to fill everything, but little by little the furor started to die down, at least until 1869. This time, the so-called monster had been seen near Orostimba Peak in Oregon. There, a man who was camping had discovered upon waking up that someone had tampered with his campfire. Around it, he had found some suggestive and enormous footprints, and without hesitation, he had followed them, believing that he would run into someone else who was playing a prank on him. He was enormously surprised when he came across a kind of gorilla that was handling a branch on which some flames still remained. The creature played with the smoking wood until a second creature, apparently female, joined in the fun. This second being had the same characteristics as the first: a body covered with long hair, a very broad back, particularly long arms, and a very upright posture for any known ape. Was this the first sighting of 2 Sasquatch at the same time? The witness of that strange event was never scared, only puzzled, and he watched the animals until they disappeared down a winding path. The man even went so far as to say that he had the rifle with him, but it never crossed his mind to shoot. Something very different happened in 1884 when it was reported from British Columbia that a small Bigfoot had been captured alive. He was named Jacko and for months was displayed as a curiosity. Then he mysteriously disappeared. It was always speculated that Jacko was just a poor monkey that some unscrupulous promoter had used to make extra money. The story of that capture is widely dismissed to this day. As you can see, all these testimonies reported a Bigfoot that, although it was huge, according to their descriptions, seemed to be docile. But little by little, as time went by, that characteristic would change. And that's how our story goes back to the beginning. Ostman was dedicated, among many other things, to searching for fossil minerals and precious metals, so he had extensive experience traveling through outdoor areas. He used to go on his excursions alone, partly so he wouldn't have to split the profits, and partly because he loved the silence and tranquility it could offer. Taking a trip with no company but yourself? However, in 1924, he was forced to share his journey with unexpected visitors. While he was sleeping in his sleeping bag in the Toba Inlet area, he was kidnapped by a huge animal, a kind of beast man, who effortlessly carried him on his shoulders and took him to spend a few days with its pack. Made up of a female with the same characteristics and 2 other smaller creatures, presumably cubs, Ostman spent 6 days captive and living with these beings, who treated him with a certain distance and respect. They fed him by bringing him sweet grass and offered him something they collected in bowls. During all that time, Ostman kept his weapon ready to fire, but he found no reason to use it. Although the others treated him with a certain distance, it was also true that they didn't seem to want to harm him. It was also a fact that Ostman couldn't escape. According to him, the 2 adults were over 8 feet tall. and the man was afraid that any attempt to escape would end up triggering an attack that he obviously wouldn't survive. Why had they kidnapped him? Perhaps they mistook him for one of their own, or was it mere curiosity? When Ostman was about to complete a week in those conditions, and when things were really starting to get complicated for his survival, the Bigfoot who abducted him from his camp discovered his chewing tobacco and promptly put it in his mouth. At first, he seemed to enjoy it, but then he started to feel sick. This was the sign Ostman needed. With the other one off guard, he decided not to look back and ran away, his heart pounding, praying that they weren't following him. He ran and ran for hours, with the feeling that sooner or later a huge claw would land on him and tear him apart right there. But that didn't happen. Sometime later, Ostman had already returned to civilization, visibly shaken. He spent weeks acting evasive and nervous, which alerted those who knew him. However, it would be 24 years before he dared to tell what had happened to him. He was afraid they would think he was crazy, and that's exactly what happened. His experience was published by various newspapers which tried to quote the man with a certain skepticism. Other colleagues laughed at him, and wildlife experts labeled him as a storyteller eager for attention. We don't know if Ostman ended up regretting telling what he told. What we do know is that his story would mark an unprecedented milestone. But that wouldn't be the only account of Bigfoots that suddenly stopped being docile and become aggressive. In fact, that same year, the testimony of a group of miners who were searching for gold and got into a fight in Monkey Canyon would emerge. Against a group, against a tribe of Bigfoots? Fighting against monsters. In 1924, a group of miners who were doing their work on the slopes of Mount St. Helena went to the United States Forest Service Rangers to make a peculiar report. Beastmen had attacked them. The story they told, which would go down in history, is as follows. Apparently, one of the miners, named Fred Beck, was doing a routine inspection of the area when he saw a strange figure trying to hide among the rocks. After giving the warning to stop and seeing that the other person didn't respond, he fired. What he heard next was a scream of pain that chilled his blood. It was a scream that didn't sound human. When he approached where it should have been, the being had come across a trail of blood, but not much else. He thought he had wounded a wild animal, and little by little the matter faded into the background. At least until that night, when the cabin where the miners were resting was besieged by a group of large, hairy men. These colossi, as they described them, threw huge stones through the windows and made the others live through a night of hell. The miners survived the attack and in the morning rushed out to talk to the security forces, who chose to believe that it was all a joke. No one believed that any man or animal could have thrown such large stones. Even less did they believe that the footprints found around could belong to any living being. It was concluded that it was all a hoax, and the account of the terrified miners was dismissed. Today, the place is known as Monkey Canyon, and there are many who believe that the first recorded battle between men and Bigfoots took place there, possibly as an act of revenge. Could this be true? Could Bigfoots become confrontational when they feel threatened? The answer seemed logical. Of course they could. The furor over this story doubled the gunfire in wooded areas, where hunters began to experience a kind of collective panic. As an interesting fact, it's worth mentioning that in 1980, Mount St. Helens once again became the scene of a strange episode involving Bigfoot. At that time, a volcano erupted, and there's an urban legend that the military went to the area, not only to help those who were in trouble, but also to take away the charred bodies of some non-human creatures that had perished in the incident. Anyway, sightings of creatures increased significantly after what happened in the Cañón de los Monos. For example, the author of the book Sasquatch, John Green, compiled a list of 1,340 sightings throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. But the modern myth of Bigfoot, or Sasquatch, took on a new form at the end of the 1950s. It was then that the case occurred in which the beast received the name by which we know it today. On Mount Mica, again in British Columbia, it was William Rowe who saw a huge creature that he would describe as half human, half animal. His testimony would become highly relevant since he himself gave it under oath. The notes about the experience multiplied, and it was thanks to this case that many of the previously mentioned cases were able to come to light. Suddenly, Bigfoot stopped being just a rumor among people interested in wildlife and became a celebrity. In fact, it was around that time that the term Bigfoot would appear. With the help of a man named Andrew Gensoli, Andrew carefully and diligently investigated a case that happened in 1958 on Bluff Creek Road. There, a tractor driver found footprints that were 45 centimeters long and 18 centimeters wide, left by a creature that apparently had a stride of 127 centimeters. Other puzzling data was added to this evidence. Neighbors in the area, for example, had found large rocks that had been dragged or heavy barrels that had been crushed, as if a gigantic being was roaming around there when no one was nearby. A plaster cast was made of these footprints and the photos went around the world. Bigfoot was born as such, and with him, a craze that remains alive to this day. It was no surprise for Andrew to start receiving more and more letters from people claiming to have found signs of giants lurking in the woods. Quickly, tales of the Yeti, the Himalayan abominable snowman, emerged, and elaborate theories about Bigfoot's origin were developed. Were they creatures of the same species? Was man, after years and years, getting closer to the lesser-known side of nature and its very evolution? Were these creatures missing links between apes and humans? In 2002, a man named Ray Wallace, owner of a logging company that operated in the area of this famous episode, showed up at local newspaper offices and claimed responsibility for the footprints. According to him, he had left them as a prank that had gotten out of hand. However, by that time, no one wanted to listen, and everyone speculated that Wallace just wanted some notoriety before he died. Moreover, less than 10 years after the incident in which the name of this beast would go down in history, it would be recorded, filmed, captured on tape. Evidence that could be said to be nowadays the most controversial evidence that exists about a cryptid. The controversial Bigfoot tape. What is probably the most famous Bigfoot sighting was recorded in 1967. The Patterson-Gimlin film is a 1-minute video that appears to show a Bigfoot, a female, later nicknamed Patty, walking through a clearing in Northern California. Bigfoot believers still consider it the best evidence of the creature's existence. The scientific community has overwhelmingly dismissed it as a person in a costume. Jeffrey Meldrum, professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University. He is not only convinced of the authenticity of the film, but he believes its credibility has increased over time. The creature's way of walking was criticized in the 1960s for being too human. But Meldrum argues that later scientific discoveries, such as Lucy, a 3.2 million-year-old extinct human ancestor, reveal that our ape-like ancestors walked upright. Not to mention that the movement of the creature's shoulders in the video when turning its head matches the movements that a monkey would make, because of its build, muscles, and joints. These are details that could only have been reproduced by wildlife experts. Additionally, Meldrum pointed out that other anatomical features visible in the film, such as the proportions of the face, match those of early humans. Special effects experts, for their part, admitted that if the supposed Bigfoot is actually a human in disguise, we would be talking about a nearly cutting-edge costume for that time. Even when trying to recreate it today, they encountered difficulties. How had Patterson, who didn't have many resources, managed to create such a realistic recreation? The critics of the film point out that Patterson had already shown intentions of turning Bigfoot into a profitable business before releasing the film. This would motivate him to deceive. Even so, the recording still cannot be completely dismissed, despite the digital updates made to it. In fact, when hair remains were found in the same area in 1976, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had to intervene. People had started to move in caravans to try to see a Bigfoot, and the chances of an accident kept increasing. To try to clarify the situation, agents from the investigation agency took the samples and analyzed them, concluding that they belonged to a deer. This verdict did not satisfy the believers, who saw it as a joke, and yet another attempt by the authorities to keep citizens away from uncomfortable truths. Truths that, according to them, continued trying to emerge in the years to come. In 1968, an infamous event occurred, the presentation of an alleged Bigfoot preserved in a block of ice. Although the authenticity of this creature was endorsed by prominent researchers who would become a cornerstone in the investigation of paranormal cases, it would later be discovered that it was a fraud. With this unmasking, the Iceman, as he was known, disappeared from the public eye and reappeared on eBay in 2013, becoming a cult piece for collectors. In this way, Bigfoot suffered a major setback by the early 70s. The media began to make fun of him, as he went from being a rarity to becoming a symbol of a hoax. However, this exile lasted only a few months. On May 2nd, being terrified the people living near the swamps in Fouke, Arkansas. The news gained popular attention when a woman was even attacked in her home. According to her description, a huge hairy hand had come in through the window and tried to take her. The whole scandal led to the release of The Legend of Boggy Creek in 1972, which grossed the astonishing sum of $20 million at the box office. Everyone who went to see it knew that, although it was fiction, it included real testimonies from people who had supposedly encountered the creature from the title. This led to the events of 1974. The now defunct North American Wildlife Research Team built a trap for Bigfoot in the Rogue River National Forest, Siskiyou. This helped Bigfoot expand his influence, and in 1976, he would be seen by two teenagers driving through upstate New York. The case would be widely reported, since after the teenagers made the corresponding report about what they had seen, a young police officer went to the area and came face to face with the impressive 2-meter-tall wild man. After they stared at each other for a few seconds, the beast fled at great speed, breaking tall branches from nearby trees. In 1986, this time in Sierra Nevada, a 16-year-old girl disappeared, supposedly kidnapped by a Bigfoot. The only witness to the incident was a 43-year-old man. For months, the girl's family lawyers tried to prove this man's guilt, but nothing could ever be proven against him or his statements. The young woman was never seen again. In the year 2000, the Skookum cast was revealed, a plaster cast that shows the footprint of what appears to be a large animal. But it's not a footprint, it's the mark the animal left when it lay down on the riverbank. It was discovered in a muddy area near Mount Adams, in the south of Washington state. While some see it as evidence of Bigfoot, others say it shows a moose lying on its side. The war between believers and skeptics was once again ruthless. Those who defend the idea that Bigfoot is real pointed to many of the others as accomplices in a huge conspiracy. The discussions escalated to an interesting question: why would the government want to hide the presence of creatures like these? The answers are quite varied. While some say they do it to avoid rewriting the way we know history. Others say that maybe these beasts are hunted and used for darker purposes, such as trafficking and slavery. Yes, you heard that right. And all these theories may have found their echo in a story that appeared in 2016, a story that talks about a Bigfoot taken down in combat. Bigfoot is killed. It all started when a YouTuber published a long interview with a military contractor identified only as Mr. K. In the interview, Mr. K claimed to have been present during Operation Enduring Freedom. In 2002, when the military was involved in fierce battles with the Taliban in their de facto capital, in Kandahar province, during the United States invasion of Afghanistan. According to Mr. K, the soldiers had discovered that the rivals had a secret weapon, a living weapon. It was a giant who stood 4 meters tall. He had bright red hair, 6 fingers, and 2 sets of teeth. The creature known as the Giant of Kandahar. He even managed to kill one of the Special Forces soldiers with a spear before the rest of the unit brought him down. With 30 seconds of continuous fire, the army is said to have taken care of hiding the creature's body. Does it make sense to think that Bigfoots are being trained as pack animals or combat beasts? Does this make sense in a world where the lethal capacity of technological weaponry increases second by second? Many people believe that if the existence of Bigfoot hasn't been formalized, it's because of this. It has nothing to do with a conspiracy, but rather with the fact that there are still many unexplored places. Science, on the other hand, while it doesn't deny the possibility of an unknown species, has tried to provide tentative answers to explain these beings that so fascinate the human imagination. The possibility was analyzed that Bigfoot might actually be a hominid believed to be extinct, that it could be a descendant of prehistoric creatures, and even the possibility that it was the representative of a tribe not adapted to society. In all cases, it was concluded that the evidence is insufficient to make more radical claims. Of course, this didn't stop more videos from appearing where Bigfoot shows off his restless and curious spirit. Skunk apes are supposed versions of Bigfoot that live in swamps and are rumored to roam the southeastern United States. October 28, 2013. A YouTube account called George Highcliffe uploaded one of the most popular skunk ape videos. In it, the cameraman films a possible skunk ape searching for food in a Mississippi swamp. In 2007, a young Bigfoot was allegedly caught on a wildlife camera in Pennsylvania. Known as the Jacobs photos, named after the owner of the trail camera that was triggered, they show a creature with long limbs and short hair, crouched on all fours. More and more videos keep appearing every year, always from different parts of the map. In the same way, there are testimonies that talk about unexplained roars or unusual footprints in places rarely visited by humans. We can choose to believe whatever we want to believe. Apparently, Bigfoot is not willing to give up his spot on the podium of the most famous cryptids. Is it just our need to put a face to our fears, or is there something more? Was the story of Bigfoot just a series of simple misunderstandings that unintentionally shaped a legend that fascinates us today? Or are we facing one of the rare, real cases with the most evidence? The aforementioned Bigfoot trap, set up in 1976, remained active until 1980. In its years of operation, it only captured bears. In 2006, the United States Forest Service repaired it, and today it is a tourist destination along the Collins Mountain hiking trail. Many believe that the mere existence of that trap is reason enough to understand why, if Bigfoot existed, they would be reluctant to interact with humans. Meanwhile, as we said at the beginning of the video, there are now numerous groups made up of professionals from various fields who continue to investigate the reports that arrive every month at different park ranger offices. Reports from people who are convinced that something unknown lives hidden in nature, a being that occasionally lets itself be seen, and maybe it's studying us just like we study it.